He knew the truth before anyone else, and he had to keep it quiet. Lieutenant Commander James Hartwell hunched over the radio console in USS Yorktown's communications center, his headphones pressed tight against his ears as static crackled through the frequencies like distant thunder. The message had come in fragmented, broken by atmospheric interference and the chaos of battle, but the pieces formed a picture that made his blood run cold. 3 Japanese carrier divisions were bearing down on Task Force 17, not the single carrier group intelligence had predicted. The enemy fleet was nearly twice the size of what Admiral Fletcher expected to face. The cramped communications compartment, buried deep within Yorktown's superstructure, felt more like a submarine than part of a massive aircraft carrier. Banks of radio equipment lined the bulkheads, their dials and meters casting an eerie glow in the red-lit darkness. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the acrid smell of overheated electronics. Around him, a dozen radiomen worked their stations with practiced efficiency, their fingers dancing across Morse keys and tuning dials, each man an essential link in the vast web of communication that held the Pacific Fleet together. But James was alone with his terrible knowledge. The intercept had come from Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor, relayed through a complex network of high-frequency transmissions that only he was authorized to decode. The Japanese had changed their naval code again, but the cryptanalysts had managed partial breaks. Enough to know that Admiral Nagumo's first air fleet was approaching with 6 carriers, not the 3 that morning's intelligence briefing had suggested. Enterprise and Hornet, steaming somewhere beyond the horizon, were walking into a trap that would make Pearl Harbor look like a skirmish. James' hands trembled slightly as he double-checked the decryption. The mathematics were unforgiving. Each character had to be perfect, each substitution verified against the codebook locked in the safe behind him. One error could mean the difference between victory and annihilation. He had learned this lesson the hard way during the Coral Sea action, when a single misinterpreted digit had sent a strike group to the wrong coordinates, costing precious time and fuel. The ship shuddered beneath his feet as Yorktown's engines pushed her through increasingly heavy seas. Somewhere above, on the flight deck, the controlled chaos of combat operations continued. Dive bombers and torpedo planes were being armed and fueled for the morning strike, their crews preparing for what they believed would be a routine attack on a lightly defended Japanese force. The irony was bitter. Those same pilots, laughing and joking as they checked their aircraft, would soon face 3 times the opposition they expected. James reached for the red telephone that connected directly to Admiral Fletcher's quarters, then hesitated. The message was clear, but incomplete. HYPO's analysts had identified the first 3 carrier divisions with reasonable certainty, but the intercepts contained references to additional surface vessels that didn't match any known Japanese formations. There were gaps in the intelligence, dangerous assumptions built on partial information. If he was wrong, if his interpretation was flawed, he would be responsible for a panic that could paralyze the American response. The weight of command settled on his shoulders like a physical burden. At 32, James had spent more years studying enemy communications than most officers had at sea. He understood the delicate balance between information and action, the terrible responsibility of being the filter through which raw intelligence became tactical reality. Too little information could lead to disaster, but premature warnings based on incomplete data could be equally catastrophic. He had joined the Navy in 1934, drawn by the promise of adventure and the certainty of steady employment during the Depression. The reality had been far different from his romantic expectations. Instead of commanding destroyers or exploring exotic ports, he had found himself assigned to the Navy's fledgling signals intelligence program, spending his days hunched over code books and radio intercepts. The work was tedious, analytical, cerebral rather than physical. But it was also vital, the unseen foundation upon which naval strategy was built. The attack on Pearl Harbor had changed everything. Suddenly, the arcane world of cryptanalysis had become the most important weapon in the Pacific. James had been aboard Yorktown during the Doolittle raid, monitoring Japanese communications as the task force raced toward Tokyo. He had listened to the enemy's confusion and panic as American bombers appeared over their homeland, their radio discipline dissolving into frantic, unencrypted transmissions that revealed more about their dispositions than months of careful intercepts. But this was different. This was not about monitoring enemy reactions to American initiatives. This was about predicting Japanese intentions, about seeing through the fog of war to understand what Admiral Yamamoto was planning. The responsibility was crushing. If James was right, and if his warning reached Fletcher in time, the American task force might survive the coming battle. If he was wrong, or if he delayed too long, 3 American carriers and 30,000 sailors could be at the bottom of the Pacific before sunset. The radio crackled again, and James adjusted his headphones. Another fragment from Pearl Harbor, this one containing references to weather conditions and fuel states. Routine logistics information, but it helped confirm the size of the approaching Japanese fleet. Only a massive formation would require the detailed supply coordination mentioned in the intercepts. He made notes on his pad, cross-referencing the new information against previous messages. The pattern was becoming clearer, but also more disturbing. This was not a simple search and destroy mission. The Japanese were committing everything they had to this operation. James closed his eyes and tried to think like Admiral Yamamoto. The Japanese commander was no fool. He had planned Pearl Harbor with meticulous attention to detail, and his operations since then had shown the same careful preparation. If he was bringing 6 carriers to Midway, he had a specific objective in mind, something worth risking the entire combined fleet to achieve. The realization struck him like a physical blow. Midway was a trap, but not in the way American intelligence believed. The Japanese were not trying to capture the island as a stepping stone to Hawaii. They were using it as bait, hoping to draw the Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle where superior numbers would guarantee victory. And Admiral Nimitz, despite all his careful planning, was giving them exactly what they wanted. James reached for the telephone again, his decision made. The intelligence was incomplete, the risks enormous, but the consequences of inaction were unthinkable. As his fingers closed around the handset, the ship's general alarm began to sound, its harsh klaxon echoing through the compartment. On the bulkhead speaker, the officer of the deck's voice cut through the noise. General quarters, all hands man your battle stations. This is not a drill. The battle for Midway was about to begin, and James Hartwell knew that he was possibly the only man in the Pacific Fleet who understood what they were really facing. The battle station's alarm had barely faded when the first contradictory reports began flooding into Yorktown's communication center. James found himself at the center of an information storm, fragments of truth and misinformation swirling together in a chaotic mixture that threatened to overwhelm even his experienced analytical mind. Contact report from Midway, called radioman First Class Mitchell from Station 3. Large formation of enemy aircraft bearing 270, distance 150 miles. He paused, adjusting his headphones. Wait, correction coming through. Distance now 120 miles. No, they're saying 180. James grimaced. The fog of war was descending with its usual vengeance, turning clear communication into a game of telephone played at the speed of life and death. He had seen this before, most recently during the chaotic final hours of the Battle of the Coral Sea, when overlapping radio transmissions and battle damage had created a bewildering maze of conflicting information. Ships had fired on their own aircraft, strike groups had attacked empty ocean, and crucial intelligence had been lost in the electronic noise of combat. "Sir," called Petty Officer Rodriguez from the encryption station, "I'm getting priority traffic from Enterprise. They're reporting enemy surface vessels bearing 040, but the position doesn't match anything from Midway or the search planes." The reports continued to pour in, each one adding another piece to a puzzle that seemed to grow more complex with every transmission. A PBY flying boat reported 4 Japanese carriers northeast of Midway, but minutes later, another patrol plane placed the enemy fleet to the northwest. A submarine contact suggested Japanese cruisers approaching from the south, while radar operators on Midway insisted the main threat was coming from the west. James felt the familiar tension building in his chest, the weight of responsibility that came with being the filter through which raw information became actionable intelligence. Every report had to be evaluated, cross-referenced, and prioritized. Some were accurate, others were mistakes, and a few might be deliberate disinformation from the enemy. The challenge was sorting truth from fiction while the battle raged around him. His earlier intercepts had provided the framework for understanding the Japanese plan, but the tactical picture remained frustratingly unclear. He knew that 6 enemy carriers were approaching, but their exact positions, courses and intentions were hidden behind a curtain of conflicting reports and electronic interference. The Americans were fighting blind, guided only by fragments of intelligence and the educated guesses of their commanders. Priority message from Admiral Fletcher, announced Chief Petty Officer Barnes, the senior radio man in the compartment. His voice carried the authority of 20 years' service and a dozen Pacific battles. He wants confirmation of enemy carrier positions before launching the strike. James nodded, understanding the Admiral's dilemma. Fletcher had learned painful lessons during the Coral Sea action, where premature attacks on incomplete intelligence had wasted precious aircraft and left his own ships vulnerable to counterattack. But delay was equally dangerous. Every minute spent gathering information gave the Japanese more time to close the distance and launch their own strike. The communication center had become a microcosm of the larger battle, with each radio operator fighting his own private war against distance, interference, and time. At Station 1, radioman Second Class Thompson worked frantically to maintain contact with the American submarines patrolling between the opposing fleets. His messages were crucial for understanding Japanese movements, but submarine communications were notoriously unreliable, limited by the need to surface and transmit quickly before diving to avoid detection. Station 2 handled air-to-surface communications, the vital link between Yorktown's combat air patrol and the ship's fighter direction center. Petty Officer Lewis had been on duty since 0400, his voice growing hoarse from hours of relaying intercept vectors and fuel states. The Japanese had not yet launched their attack on the American carriers, but their search planes were probing the perimeter of Task Force 17, forcing constant adjustments to the defensive fighter coverage. At Station 4, the newest member of the team, Seaman Kowalski, struggled with the flood of damage control reports coming from various ships in the formation. The destroyer Hammond had suffered a steering casualty during an emergency turn. The cruiser Astoria was experiencing problems with her fire control radar, and 2 of Yorktown's own aircraft had been forced to ditch with mechanical failures. Each report had to be logged, prioritized, and forwarded to the appropriate department, but it was Station 5 that drew James' most concerned attention. Radioman First Class Washington, one of the Navy's most experienced Japanese linguists, was monitoring enemy communications directly, trying to pierce the veil of operational security that surrounded the approaching fleet. His face was drawn with concentration as he adjusted frequency dials and scribbled notes on his pad. "Sir," Washington called softly, his voice barely audible over the electronic noise. "I'm picking up what sounds like launch preparations. Multiple carriers, coordinated timing. But the signals are fragmentary, and there's a lot of atmospheric interference." James felt his pulse quicken. If Washington was right, the Japanese were preparing to launch their own strike, possibly at the American task force. The timing would be crucial. If Fletcher could get his own attack airborne first, he might catch the enemy carriers with their planes on deck, vulnerable to dive bombers and torpedoes. But if the Japanese launched first, Yorktown and her consorts would face the same devastating attack that had crippled Pearl Harbor. The irony was bitter. James possessed intelligence that could change the outcome of the battle, but it was incomplete, fragmentary, and unverified. His intercepts from Pearl Harbor had revealed the strategic picture, but the tactical situation remained maddeningly unclear. He was like a man trying to assemble a jigsaw puzzle while blindfolded, with pieces scattered by hurricane winds. The ship's ventilation system hummed steadily in the background, drawing stale air from the communication center and replacing it with slightly fresher air from the intake vents. But nothing could eliminate the smell of fear and tension that permeated the compartment. Sweat stained the sailors' shirts despite the air conditioning, and cigarette consumption had increased dramatically since general quarters sounded. Several men had developed nervous tics, unconsciously tapping fingers or bouncing legs as they worked. James understood their anxiety. Unlike the pilots and gunners topside, who could fight back against visible enemies, the communication specialists were condemned to listen helplessly while battles were fought beyond their reach. They could hear aircraft engines warming up on the flight deck, feel the ship heel over during high-speed turns, and sense the approach of combat in the increasingly urgent tone of radio transmissions. But they could only wait and listen, processing information that other men would use to live or die. A new series of reports began arriving from the search planes, and James felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that accompanied fresh intelligence. The pieces of the puzzle were finally beginning to fit together. But the picture they revealed was even more disturbing than his worst fears. The Japanese were not approaching in the standard formation intelligence had predicted. They were split into multiple groups, approaching from different directions in a complex pattern that suggested careful coordination and detailed planning. "Mitchell, get Admiral Fletcher's staff on the horn," James ordered. "Priority flash message." He paused, considering his words carefully. The message would be brief, necessarily limited to essential facts, but it might be the most important communication of the war. "Tell them we have confirmed multiple enemy carrier groups approaching from different vectors. The Japanese are not using standard formation doctrine. Recommend immediate launch of maximum available strike." As Mitchell began transmitting the message, James reflected on the weight of his words. He was recommending that Admiral Fletcher commit everything he had to an attack based on incomplete information and educated guesswork. If he was wrong, the American carriers would be left defenseless, their aircraft scattered across hundreds of miles of empty ocean, while Japanese bombers approached unopposed. But if he was right, and if Fletcher acted on his recommendation, Task Force 17 might achieve the kind of victory that would change the course of the Pacific War. The Japanese had never expected to face such aggressive American tactics, and their own doctrine emphasized careful preparation and overwhelming superiority. A bold strike, launched while they were still approaching, might catch them completely off guard. The communications center fell silent except for the steady crackle of radio static. In the distance, James could hear the deep rumble of aircraft engines starting up, the sound of America's response to his intelligence estimate. Within minutes, every available bomber and torpedo plane would be airborne, racing toward an enemy that existed more in theory than confirmed fact. He had done his job, but the real test was just beginning. The hours that followed Fletcher's launch decision transformed the communications center into a nerve center of desperate uncertainty. James found himself increasingly isolated, not just physically in the bowels of the ship, but intellectually and emotionally as the weight of his intelligence estimates pressed down on him like the tons of steel and water above his head. Reports from the strike groups began arriving in fragments, each transmission raising more questions than it answered. Lieutenant Commander Wade M.C. Kluski, leading Enterprise's dive bombers, reported contact with enemy ships, but his position was nearly 50 miles from where Japanese carriers were supposed to be. The torpedo squadrons from all three American carriers had scattered across hundreds of square miles of ocean, each one hunting for targets that seemed to shift and vanish like mirages. "Sir," called Washington from the Japanese intercept station, his voice tight with concern. "I'm getting communications that suggest major enemy formations are still approaching, but the positions don't match anything our strike groups are reporting." James felt his stomach drop. The nightmare scenario was unfolding exactly as he had feared. The Japanese fleet was larger and more dispersed than anyone had imagined, and the American strike was fragmenting as it groped through empty ocean searching for enemies that might not even be there. His intelligence estimates, the foundation for Fletcher's battle plan, were proving catastrophically inadequate. The isolation of command had never felt more crushing. Above him, on Yorktown's bridge and in the flag spaces, Admiral Fletcher and his staff were making life and death decisions based on information that James had provided. They trusted his expertise, his years of experience with enemy communications, his reputation for analytical precision. But now, listening to the confused reports from the strike groups, James began to doubt everything he thought he knew about the Japanese plan. Had he misinterpreted the intercepts from Pearl Harbor? Was it possible that the enemy fleet was smaller than he had estimated, that his fears of a massive Japanese trap had led him to see patterns that didn't exist? The mathematics of cryptanalysis were supposed to be objective, immune to the psychological pressures of combat. But James was beginning to realize that human judgment was always fallible, especially when filtered through the stress and uncertainty of battle. "Contact report from Bombing 6, announced Mitchell, his voice cutting through James' growing despair. "They found something. Multiple carriers bearing 090 from point option, distance approximately 200 miles. The communication center erupted in controlled excitement as operators scrambled to plot the new position and relay it to other strike groups. But James felt only a deeper sense of foreboding. If M.C. Kluski had found Japanese carriers to the northeast, what about the other formations that the intercepts had suggested? Were there more enemy ships approaching from different directions, preparing to catch the Americans in a classic pincer movement? His fears were confirmed minutes later when Washington intercepted a transmission that made his blood run cold. Speaking in rapid, unencrypted Japanese, an enemy radio operator was reporting successful launch operations from multiple carrier groups. The transmission was brief and fragmentary, cut short by atmospheric interference, but the implications were terrifying. While American dive bombers were attacking one Japanese formation, other enemy carriers were launching their own strikes. Chief Barnes, James called urgently. "Get Damage Control Central on the line. Tell them we may have inbound hostiles from multiple vectors. The Japanese are launching a coordinated attack." But even as he gave the order, James realized the futility of his warning. Yorktown's radar operators were already tracking suspicious contacts. Her fighter direction officer was vectoring combat air patrol to intercept approaching bandits, and her gun crews were preparing for the kind of coordinated enemy attack that had devastated Pearl Harbor. The ship was as ready as any vessel could be for what was coming, but James knew that readiness might not be enough. The next hour passed in a blur of frantic activity and mounting tension. Reports from the American strike groups became increasingly confused and contradictory. Some pilots reported successful attacks on Japanese carriers, with dramatic descriptions of exploding aircraft and billowing smoke. Others reported finding only cruisers and destroyers, or empty ocean where carriers were supposed to be. The fog of war had descended with a vengeance, turning what should have been a coordinated attack into a desperate scramble across hundreds of miles of Pacific Ocean. Meanwhile, Japanese aircraft were approaching Task Force 17 with the kind of precise coordination that James had learned to fear during his years of monitoring enemy communications. The intercepts suggested multiple attack groups approaching from different altitudes and directions, timed to arrive simultaneously and overwhelm American defenses. It was textbook Japanese doctrine, executed with the kind of professional precision that had made their navy the terror of the Pacific. "Sir," called Rodriguez from the encryption station, his voice barely controlled. "Priority from Enterprise. They're under attack. Heavy casualties reported." James closed his eyes, feeling the weight of failure settle on his shoulders. His intelligence had sent American carriers into battle against impossible odds, and now sailors were dying because of his analytical errors. The Japanese had baited their trap perfectly, using Midway as a lure to draw the Pacific Fleet into a decisive engagement where superior numbers would guarantee victory. But then, cutting through his despair, came a transmission that changed everything. Lieutenant Clarence Dickinson, flying a damaged dive bomber back from the strike, reported massive explosions aboard multiple Japanese carriers. His voice was hoarse with excitement and battle fatigue, but his words were clear. The enemy fleet was burning. 3 carriers hit hard, Dickinson reported. Massive secondary explosions, probably ordnance and aviation fuel. 1 carrier appears to be sinking, 2 others dead in the water. The communications center erupted in cheers, but James remained focused on the broader tactical picture. If the American strike had indeed crippled 3 Japanese carriers, the odds in the battle had shifted dramatically, but his intercepts suggested that at least 3 more enemy carriers were still operational, and their aircraft were approaching Task Force 17 with lethal intent. The next few minutes would determine whether Dickinson's report represented a decisive American victory or merely the opening phase of a larger catastrophe. James could only listen and wait as the battle reached its climax, knowing that his intelligence estimates had set these events in motion, but no longer able to influence their outcome. The ship shuddered suddenly, a different vibration than the steady rhythm of her engines. Somewhere above, Yorktown's anti-aircraft guns had opened fire, their 5-inch shells exploding in the sky like deadly flowers. The Japanese attack had arrived, and now it was time for other men to fight the battle that James' intelligence had made possible. He thought of the pilots he had sent into combat with his estimates, the young men who had climbed into their aircraft trusting that his analysis would guide them to the enemy and home again. Some of them were already dead, their planes shattered by Japanese fighters or lost in the vast emptiness of the Pacific. Others were still fighting, their lives hanging in the balance as they pressed home attacks against desperate odds. The isolation was complete now. James had done everything his training and experience could accomplish, but the outcome was beyond his control. All he could do was listen to the radio chatter and try to piece together the fragments of a battle that would determine the fate of nations. In the red-lit darkness of the communications center, Surrounded by the electronic heartbeat of modern warfare, he waited for news that would tell him whether his intelligence had saved the Pacific Fleet or condemned it to destruction. The weight of truth had never felt heavier, and the burden of keeping secrets had never seemed more crushing. But the battle was no longer his to fight. It belonged to the pilots and gunners, the damage control parties and medical officers, all the men who would live or die based on the information he had provided. James could only wait and listen, isolated in his electronic world, while the fate of the Pacific War hung in the balance above his head. The first bomb hit Yorktown at 12:05 hours, and James felt the world explode around him. The communication center, buried deep within the carrier's armored hull, should have been one of the safest places on the ship. But the Japanese bomb, a converted 16-inch naval shell filled with high explosive, punched through the flight deck and detonated 3 compartments above, sending shock waves through the steel structure that rattled equipment and shattered gauges throughout James' electronic domain. The lights went out instantly, plunging the compartment into absolute darkness before the red emergency lighting flickered on. In that brief moment of blindness, James heard the sounds that would haunt his dreams for years to come. The screech of twisted metal, the hiss of ruptured steam lines, and worst of all, the sudden silence from several radio stations as equipment failed and operators were thrown from their chairs. Damage report. James shouted over the chaos, his training taking over even as his mind struggled to process what had happened. Around him, his men were picking themselves up from the deck, checking equipment, and trying to restore communications that might mean the difference between survival and death. "Station 3 is down hard, sir," called Chief Barnes, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. "Mitchell's unconscious, and the primary transmitter is smashed." He paused, checking other stations. "Station 5 has lost antenna connection, and Washington's having trouble with the Japanese intercept receiver." James felt panic rising in his throat. The battle was reaching its climax. American strike groups were still attacking Japanese carriers, and enemy bombers were pressing home their attacks on Task Force 17. This was precisely the moment when accurate communications were most critical, and his carefully orchestrated intelligence network was falling apart around him. A second explosion shook the ship, this one closer to the communication center. The deck plates buckled slightly, and James heard the ominous sound of flooding somewhere below. Yorktown was hurt, possibly dying, and he was losing his ability to coordinate the intelligence that might save what remained of the American fleet. But even as chaos reigned around him, fragments of information continued to flow through the damaged equipment. Washington, despite a broken radio and a probable concussion, managed to intercept a crucial Japanese transmission. His voice was weak, but urgent as he called across the compartment. "Sir, I'm getting something about a 4th carrier. The enemy has another formation approaching from the northwest." James felt his blood freeze. A 4th carrier group would tip the balance decisively in favor of the Japanese, especially with Yorktown damaged and possibly sinking. He had underestimated the enemy force again, and his failures were compounding with each passing minute. But he also realized that this intelligence, fragmentary as it was, might be the key to American survival. "Rodriguez, can you get through to Enterprise?" he asked urgently. The encryption station had lost its primary antenna, but the backup systems might still be functional. "Trying, sir, but there's a lot of interference, could be jamming, or just battle damage to our transmitters." The minutes that followed tested every skill James had developed during his years in naval intelligence. Working with damaged equipment and injured personnel, he struggled to piece together a coherent picture of the tactical situation. The American strike had indeed devastated 3 Japanese carriers, just as Lieutenant Dickinson had reported, but the enemy still possessed significant striking power. Worse, the approaching 4th carrier group was perfectly positioned to catch the American fleet while it was recovering aircraft and dealing with battle damage. Station by station, James rebuilt his communication network. Thompson, despite a dislocated shoulder, managed to restore contact with the submarines patrolling between the fleets. Lewis, working with a cracked headset and failing voice, maintained the crucial link with Yorktown's combat air patrol. Even young Kowalski, shaken by his first experience of combat, continued to log damage reports and casualty figures with methodical precision. But it was Washington who provided the intelligence breakthrough that changed everything. Despite his injuries and damaged equipment, The experienced linguist managed to intercept a series of Japanese transmissions that revealed the location and intentions of the fourth carrier group. More importantly, his intercepts suggested that this formation was operating independently, separated from the main enemy fleet by more than 100 miles. "Sir," Washington called weakly, "I think they're divided. The fourth carrier is trying to coordinate with the burning ships, but they're having communication problems. Something about changing rendezvous points and fuel shortages." James felt the pieces of the puzzle suddenly snap into place. The Japanese, despite their superior numbers and careful planning, were facing the same communication difficulties that plagued all naval operations. Their fleet was scattered across hundreds of miles of ocean. Their coordinated attack plan was falling apart, and their commanders were struggling to maintain control as their flagship carriers burned and sank. It was exactly the kind of opportunity that aggressive American commanders could exploit, but only if they received accurate and timely intelligence. James looked around the damaged communication center, at his injured men working desperately to maintain contact with the outside world, and realized that the next few minutes would determine not just the outcome of the Battle of Midway, but possibly the entire Pacific War. "Chief Barnes," he called urgently, "get Admiral Fletcher on the horn. Priority flash message." He paused, considering his words carefully. This might be his last chance to influence the battle, and every word would matter. "Tell him we have confirmation of a fourth enemy carrier group operating independently northwest of the main body. Recommend immediate strike to prevent coordinated enemy attack." As Barnes worked frantically to establish contact with the flag bridge, James felt the familiar weight of command responsibility settle on his shoulders one last time. His earlier intelligence estimates had sent American pilots into combat against impossible odds, but they had also achieved stunning success against 3 Japanese carriers. Now, with Yorktown damaged and his communication systems failing, he was making one final recommendation that could either complete the American victory or expose the remaining carriers to devastating counterattack. The ship shuddered again as another Japanese bomb exploded somewhere above, but this time James barely noticed. All his attention was focused on the radio transmissions crackling through the damaged equipment, the fragments of intelligence that would determine whether Task Force 17 survived the next few hours. In the red-lit darkness of the communication center, surrounded by the electronic debris of modern warfare, he waited to learn whether his lifetime of preparation for this moment had been enough to save the Pacific Fleet. The isolation was complete now, but it no longer felt like a burden. James had done everything his training and experience could accomplish, and the outcome was in other hands. Above him, Admiral Fletcher was making the tactical decisions that would win or lose the battle. On the flight deck, if it still existed, aircraft were being prepared for what might be the final strike of the day. And somewhere beyond the horizon, Japanese carriers were burning while their surviving sister ships struggled to organize a counterattack that could still turn defeat into victory. James thought of all the young men whose lives had been shaped by his intelligence estimates. Pilots who had flown into combat trusting his analysis, sailors who had manned their battle stations based on his warnings, commanders who had made crucial decisions using information he had provided. Some of them were already dead, casualties of a battle that his intelligence had made inevitable. Others were still fighting, their futures hanging in the balance as the greatest naval battle in history reached its climax. The weight of truth had never been heavier, but James no longer felt crushed by it. He had carried his burden with honor, had provided his commanders with the best intelligence possible under impossible circumstances, and had played his part in a victory that was still taking shape in the smoke and chaos above his head. Whether that victory would be complete or partial, decisive or Pyrrhic, was no longer his responsibility to determine. The battle belonged to other men now, and James could finally allow himself to hope that his long years of preparation had been enough to see them through. The silence was what struck James most profoundly when the battle finally ended. After 18 hours of continuous operations, the communication center had fallen into an eerie quiet broken only by the steady hum of ventilation fans and the occasional crackle of routine transmissions. The frantic urgency of combat had given way to the methodical work of damage assessment and casualty reporting. But for James, the transition felt like emerging from a fever dream into cold, harsh reality. Yorktown was dying beneath his feet. The carrier had taken 3 bombs and 2 torpedo hits, and despite the heroic efforts of her damage control teams, she was slowly settling by the stern. Water lapped at the lower decks, and the ship's list was increasing with each passing hour. Admiral Fletcher had already transferred his flag to a cruiser, taking his staff and the burden of tactical command to a vessel that could still fight effectively. But James remained at his post, supervising the evacuation of classified materials and ensuring that vital intelligence documents didn't fall into enemy hands. It was a task that required the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized his entire career. But it felt different now, tinged with the melancholy of endings and the bitter satisfaction of duty completed under fire. The battle's outcome had exceeded even his most optimistic projections. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers lay at the bottom of the Pacific, along with most of their experienced pilots and irreplaceable aircraft. The enemy's First Air Fleet, the force that had struck Pearl Harbor and rampaged across the Pacific for 6 months, had been effectively destroyed. Admiral Yamamoto's carefully planned operation to eliminate the American carrier force had instead resulted in the crippling of his own fleet and the beginning of Japan's long retreat toward defeat. Yet victory had come at a terrible cost, and James felt the weight of every American life lost in the battle he had helped orchestrate. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet had been virtually annihilated, 15 aircraft and their crews lost in a gallant but futile attack on the Japanese fleet. Dozens of other pilots and aircrew had been killed or wounded, their planes shot down by enemy fighters or lost in the vast emptiness of the Pacific. Yorktown herself was dying, and with her would go a piece of American naval history that could never be replaced. The intelligence reports crossing his desk painted a picture of tactical success built on strategic transformation. The Japanese had lost not just ships and aircraft, but their aura of invincibility and their offensive capability in the Central Pacific. American forces, bloodied but victorious, now possessed the initiative and would begin the long advance toward Tokyo. The balance of power in the Pacific had shifted decisively, and it had happened largely because James had correctly interpreted a series of fragmentary radio intercepts from Pearl Harbor. But as he supervised the final evacuation of the communication center, James found himself thinking not about grand strategy or historical significance, but about the individual moments of decision that had shaped the battle. The choice to recommend an immediate strike based on incomplete intelligence. The decision to warn Fletcher about the 4th Carrier Group despite his damaged communications. The countless small judgments that had accumulated into a victory none of them had dared to hope for. "Sir," called Chief Barnes, interrupting his reverie. The senior radio man's head was bandaged, and his left arm hung in a makeshift sling. But he had refused evacuation until the last classified document was secured. "That's the last of the code books. Rodriguez and the others are already in the boats." James nodded, taking a final look around the compartment that had been his world for the past day and night. The radio equipment that had connected him to the far reaches of the Pacific Fleet stood silent now, their screens dark and their speakers quiet. The charts and code books that had helped him penetrate Japanese intentions were secured in weighted bags, ready to be destroyed rather than captured. In a few minutes, he and Barnes would climb to the flight deck and abandon the ship that had carried them through the most decisive naval battle in American history. As they made their way through flooded passages and up twisted ladders, James reflected on the strange isolation that had defined his war. While other men had fought with guns and bombs, torpedoes and aircraft, he had battled with mathematics and linguistics, cryptanalysis and communications theory. His weapons had been invisible, his victories measured in correctly interpreted intercepts and timely intelligence reports. But those weapons had proven as decisive as any dive bomber or torpedo plane, perhaps more so. The flight deck, when they finally reached it, was a scene of controlled chaos. Yorktown's crew was abandoning ship in good order, but the carrier's death throes were becoming increasingly apparent. Her list had increased to nearly 20 degrees, making movement difficult and dangerous. Smoke still rose from bomb damage forward, and the smell of fuel oil and burning insulation hung heavy in the air. James found himself in one of the last boats to leave Yorktown, watching as the great ship slowly rolled over and slipped beneath the waves. She had been his home for 2 years, the platform from which he had conducted some of the most important intelligence operations of the war. Now she was gone, along with the communication center where he had decoded the messages that won the Battle of Midway. But as the boat pulled away from the sinking carrier, James realized that his real victory was not measured in ships sunk or battles won, but in the transformation of American naval intelligence from a peacetime curiosity into a weapon of war. The lessons learned at Midway would reshape how the Navy fought for the remainder of the Pacific campaign, with communications intelligence playing an increasingly central role in operational planning. The rescue destroyer that picked up Yorktown survivors was already buzzing with news from across the Pacific. American forces were advancing on multiple fronts, emboldened by the victory at Midway and the proof that Japanese naval power could be defeated. But James knew that future victories would depend as much on intelligence preparation as on tactical execution, and the Navy would need officers trained in the arcane arts of cryptanalysis and communication intercept. Standing on the destroyer's deck as the sun set over the Pacific, James felt the weight of responsibility shifting rather than lifting. He had helped win a decisive battle, but the war was far from over. Japan still possessed powerful naval forces, experienced commanders, and the desperate determination of a nation fighting for survival. The intelligence war would continue, fought in radio intercept stations and code-breaking facilities scattered across the Pacific, and James knew that his real work was just beginning. Chief Barnes joined him at the rail, both men watching the oil slick that marked Yorktown's final resting place. "Hell of a thing, sir," the veteran radioman said quietly. 18 months ago, most folks didn't even know what signals intelligence was. Now it's maybe the most important weapon we've got. James nodded, thinking of all the young officers and enlisted men who would follow in his footsteps, learning to fight a war with mathematics and intuition rather than guns and explosives. They would face the same terrible isolation he had experienced, the same crushing responsibility of being the filter through which raw information became tactical reality. But they would also know, as he now knew, that their invisible war could be as decisive as any fought on the surface of the sea. The destroyer's radio crackled with traffic from across the Pacific Fleet, reports and orders flowing through the communication networks that James had helped to perfect. Somewhere in that electronic maze, other intelligence officers were working to penetrate enemy intentions and predict Japanese reactions to their defeat at Midway. The war would go on, but it would be fought with a new understanding of information as a weapon and intelligence as the foundation of victory. James pulled his jacket closer against the evening wind and turned away from the rail. Tomorrow, there would be debriefings, and after action reports, lessons learned and procedures refined. There would be new codes to break and fresh intelligence to analyze. The Battle of Midway was over, but the intelligence war that had made victory possible was just beginning to reach its full potential. He had known the truth before anyone else, and had been forced to keep it quiet until the moment was right to act. Now, as the Pacific Fleet began its long advance toward Tokyo, James understood that the burden of secret knowledge would only grow heavier with each passing day. But it was a burden he was prepared to carry because he had learned at Midway that the price of victory was not just measured in ships and lives, but in the willingness of a few men to bear the terrible weight of knowing what others could not be told. The war was far from over, but the foundation for ultimate victory had been laid in the red-lit darkness of Yorktown's communication center, built from intercepted radio signals and the analytical courage to act on incomplete information. James had done his part in that victory, and now it was time to prepare for the battles yet to come. As the destroyer steamed toward Pearl Harbor, carrying the survivors of one of history's most decisive naval battles, James Hartwell stood silently at the rail and contemplated the strange isolation of the intelligence officer's war. He had fought with invisible weapons and won victories that few would ever fully understand. But he had also learned that the burden of secret knowledge was the price that free nations paid for the privilege of remaining free. The Pacific stretched endlessly toward the horizon, and somewhere beyond that vast expanse, the war continued. There would be other battles, other intelligence coups, other moments when the fate of nations hung on the correct interpretation of a fragmentary radio intercept. James was ready for whatever came next, because he had learned at Midway that the weight of truth, however crushing it might seem, was always bearable when carried in service of a just cause. The Battle of Midway was over, but the intelligence war that had won it would continue until the last Japanese garrison surrendered and the Pacific was finally at peace. And in that continuing struggle, men like James Hartwell would carry their invisible burdens with quiet pride, knowing that their secret victories had helped to preserve the world from tyranny and make possible the return of peace to a war-torn globe.